My grandfather told me a story once, as we sat around a campfire in his backyard, in the cool night of the Arizona desert. The horizon was clear, and each star twinkled in a purple sky, with a full fat moon hanging low over the mountains. His voice was raspy and gravely, the result of a lifetime of smoking cigars and drinking whiskey. The fire danced and shined across his wide, dark eyes as he settled into his seat, ready to tell his story. Way back when I was a boy, about your age, he began, I lived outside an Apache reservation with your great-grandfather. He had returned from the war and set about raising horses and cattle on a 100-acre ranch settled between a brambly mountainside, with dirt good for growing thorn brush and not much else. One night, my mother was sick, and Pa and I took a trip to town, about 50 miles away, straight through a dry desert, over a washed-out creek, and some old abandoned farmsteads. The fire sparked and a log cracked, jolting me out of the story. "What's next?" I asked. "Settle down, boy. You'll hear soon enough." Pa and I were driving in an old Ford pickup truck. I remember it was dark out, inky and thick, with only the lights of our old truck lighting up the road. I remember too when the engine began to sputter and the truck slowed to a jerky stop. "God damn it," Pa said, guiding the Ford to the side of the road. As it coasted to a halt, "Stay here, son," as he stepped out into the darkness, shutting the door with a heavy thud. My window was down, and the cool desert air was breezy and felt good on my hot face and neck. Pa was getting water from the back to cool the engine, and that's when I smelled it. Rotten eggs. Strange, I thought, to smell sulfur in the desert. My nose also picked up carrion, like one of them dead bloated cattle that would drop from the heat and lay there until the crows pecked enough holes in their hide to cause the whole thing to explode. It stunk and I gagged. My skin started to tingle too. The back of my neck felt itchy and my face started to get hot. The wind stopped blowing and hung still and heavy, with the stink filling the cab. "Pa," I called. "Pa! Pa!" No answer. My heart started beating, and I felt such a fear in me, in my bones, in my chest. Boy, I tell you, I never felt fear like this. Not until Vietnam. Not until I saw young men dying around me. I locked the door and reached over for my pa's door and saw a shadow bound across the road, through both dim beams of light, across the partly open domed hood. Grandfather paused. He spit a fat wad of tobacco spit to his side, and he looked pensively into the darkness. I realized I was holding my breath and gasped for air. The night was cool, but I was sweating and clammy. "Well, what happened? What about your father? What did you see?" He sighed. "A creature." He shook his head. "You have to understand. There were legends, old legends, older than the rock cairns out in the valley, older still than Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, than the old Indian chiefs and their shamans, the Apache and Hopi and Cherokee, and all of them old tribes and First Peoples, They told tales, old stories about dark engine magic, a deal made with the old spirits of blood sacrifice to gain power, old power, enough to fight each other and the Spaniards, and later the white men that came from their land and women they called them. He paused. Grandfather took a deep breath and bodied forth into his tale. Across the fire and the sky, the desert, the creek, the moon, the sun, and old mountains, he bodied forward. They call them skinwalkers, shape changers, old warriors resurrected as skinless men, all sinew and muscle, walking on deer legs, with the torso of a man and the head of a coyote. But messed up, boy, long and malformed snouts, teeth like a bowie knife, long arms, and standing 7 foot, hunched over. They'd gut the old cowboys and white riders. They'd run through bullets and sabers, part the Spanish armor like it was a potato sack. Wily, too, they could change their voice to match a person you knew or might know. Boy, that's what I saw. Big and fast, only for a second. It ran across the road. Gray and mottled, muscle flexing under its legs, hooves clomping on the road, stringy muscled hunched shoulders. And it turned, looked right into the cab, looked right into my eyes, and I swear, boy, I swear, it grinned at me. I sank into my seat, in shock, in fear, shaking. I knew death was near. The air was electric. I smelled ozone and brimstone. The air felt like right before the lightning comes and blows a tree to smithereens. Charged and full with power. I yelled for my paw, but no words came out, just a dry squeak. I was shaking, as Grandfather told his story. He was still here, so I know he lived, but the supernatural always fascinated me, and even now, I felt the force of his words. The real power of skinwalkers was trickery. Sure, they could change their voices, but also their skin. That's why the gods took their hide, so they could take others. Not for long, the legends say, maybe an hour, before the soul of the skin they wore would come looking for their mortal shell, before going to whatever hell awaited them. Though I think that getting skinned alive was hell enough. A minute passed in what felt like a lifetime, 1 second in 1,000 years. My father's door opened and I jerked my head to the left, putting my fists up to fend off attack. "Son, it's me," my father said, before climbing into the cab. He grasped the steering wheel and pulled himself in awkwardly, jerking himself into the seat. I cringed into the corner. I looked at him. I looked hard. "Boy, your great-grandfather was a good man, treated me and my ma right. He fought the Nazis and saw the worst of man in Poland when he freed all them camps. And now I was taking his measure. Is this my father? Do I make a run, or do I die? Is it him, or not? Let's go get that medicine for your ma," as he pulled the truck into gear and pulled it out onto the road, and our trip resumed. I guess it was him, after all. "But how did you know? Was it because he said something about your mom?" "No, boy. I knew because out the window, out of the corner of my eye, I seen that beast running 50 miles an hour right next to the car, looking at me with them yellow eyes and grinning mouth. I looked and saw it, hunched and angry, running next to us, boy. My paw kept his eyes on the road, locked straight forward. "Son," he said, "don't look at it. Don't look at it." That's how I knew, boy. I've had a draft of this story set up for a while, but I've been too worried and scared to tell. It made me question everything. My faith, my eyes, my sanity. I've decided it's time to finally let others know what I've experienced, as it may help me move on. At least that's what I hope. I recently moved westward to Arizona from the boring state of Oklahoma. I'm a devout Christian, and never once before this had I believed there were entities in existence that we couldn't hunt down with our modern advancements. It's 2019, for heaven's sake. You'd figure if we wanted to find something, we would, and most of all, we could. It was the 23rd of December, 2018. I was in Payson, Arizona, a bit north of Phoenix. My friends and I, in our Christmas spirit, decided to head out north of town, about 5 to 6 miles or so into the forest, on a secluded trail. It was cold that night. Some of my friends shivered and displayed obvious signs of unpreparedness. I was layered fairly well, and yet the winds and frigid cold punctured through my layers and onto me. We wanted to make a bonfire, warm up, enjoy ourselves, and have a few drinks. I knew as soon as I got into the car to head that way, something was off. I felt sick, uneasy, and something in my gut told me that I should just stay home. But I couldn't put my finger on just what, and so I ignored my ever-so-looming feelings of anxiety. We picked up friends and headed to the trail. I'm a huge nature lover and always felt safe in the confines of the forest. I felt in control, at ease, but not tonight. It may sound cliche, but I'll be damned if it didn't feel like someone or something was watching me when we finally got there. And when I'd gotten far enough down the trail that turning back would be no hasty endeavor, it finally hit me why I felt so eerie. That same year, during the weeks prior to Thanksgiving, I was here before. It's not a spot we usually go to, therefore I wasn't familiar with it, nor were my friends. We were coming out for the same reason we were in December, for a couple drinks around a bonfire. It was late. I, however, hadn't had any spirits that night. It was my job to gather firewood. I didn't mind. My chance to survey and explore the area around us wouldn't be bad. Before I even left our area, things took a turn for the strange. I was at the edge of the light being cast from the small bonfire I was to gather more fuel for. In the faint glow of the far trees, I caught a glimpse of something dart behind a tall pine. I asked backwards to my friends if it was out of the ordinary for people to be hanging around this spot. My query was only met with silence from them as they drank on. I took a few more steps beyond the comfort of the blaze, keeping my eyes fixed on the tall, shadowy figure fixated behind the tall trees. I could faintly make out that it had moved in a slight bobbing motion, like a buoy upon a tide. My immediate thoughts drew a blank as to why someone would be out here doing this. Maybe I was seeing things, or it was a prank of some sort. I opened my mouth to call out, or even crack a joke, but was mortified when I realized I couldn't speak. Something inside me prevented me from making any noise. My heart raced. As it swiftly came, it shot off into the distance, like a bullet. Being startled so badly, I fell back onto the ground and kicked myself back like a spooked animal, scratching and cutting my hands as I did so. My friends saw me and laughed, thinking I was drunk. I managed to stammer out a line about what I saw, but was only met with a few blank stares and laughs, making me sound stupid. For the rest of the night, I never dared to step away from the beams of the bonfire. As I walked down the trail that frigid December evening, I remember what I had seen and felt on that cold November night, and my stomach dropped. My friends were slurring out Christmas carols and other drunk epiphanies. I know they wouldn't listen to me even if I spoke out, so I ignored the guttural feelings, prayed for the best, and walked on. I hadn't been drinking much this night either. I don't enjoy alcohol as much as my friends, and often I was the one responsible for herding them home when the night was over. However, to calm my tense nerves, I had a drink or two from some Jaeger we had chilled in the ice chest. It was Christmas after all. It worked. We were all having a good time, enjoying our festive feelings and generally savoring the crisp forest atmosphere. Soon, nature called, and forgetting my prior ordeal, I began to walk away from the fire to relieve myself. I walked a fair 300 or so feet towards a big rock resting behind some fallen trees, not wanting to be seen doing my business. I wasn't even far enough away from the fire to not be able to hear my friends' voices echoing through the woodlands. From behind me, my friend Corbin, who had come along, called out my name. I'll admit, I was tipsy, but nowhere near enough to not differentiate reality from a drunken stupor. I remember calling out to him, telling him to give me a moment to finish. I zipped up and turned to walk around to the rock where I heard him wonder to. I don't know what it was, but sure as all heaven above and hell below, it was not Corbin. It took me a minute for my woozy mind to put this together and stop walking towards it. I'm thankful I did. This being stood tall, at least 6 to 7 feet. Its eyes burned like fire. It moved from a dog-like four-limb position to standing tall. The light from the moon on this cold night radiated the body, showing off its dark, slender shape with an inhumane sheen. I began to sob violently. My mind ran in panicked circles. Seconds felt like lifetimes as my world ground to a screeching halt at the clawed feet of the beast that I was sure was going to take my life right then and there. I did the only thing I could think to do. I dropped to my knees and began to pray. This monster, to my petrified brain, had to have been the devil himself. To imagine him anything worse than it would be impossible. It did not like my pleas to God. An unholy shriek of what I can only think to describe as someone screaming loudly with lungs full of water rang out. I screamed in terror, and with all the strength I could muster, lunged backwards across the forest floor, running as fast as my legs could take me. I fell a few times, I think in sheer panic. I just couldn't manage to get my body to work properly, knowing that thing was near. When I returned in a panicked craze to the fire, covered in sweat, dirt, and tears, I managed to wheeze out what happened somewhat through my sobs of fear. I could tell they doubted whether or not what I was desperately stammering was real or not. I think I was so horrified in that moment that I had a small seizure, because everything else is a blur. I remember going to the truck, leaving. I remember waking up the next day, receiving a multitude of texts saying I was either stupid or crazy, or texts from worried friends asking if I was okay. And I also remember the last I saw of that thing before I made my frenzied flee, when it smiled back at me through the forest and skittered off into the darkness. A few days after Christmas, I was able to get in touch with a native elder here in town. I was so scared mentioning the event because I was worried of being mocked or him not believing me. To a twist of my thinking, I told him very vividly what I had encountered. He wholeheartedly believed and told me it was a skinwalker. He then blessed me thoroughly and told me to leave that stretch of land alone and to never venture out there again. Next time, I might not be so lucky. He didn't have to tell me twice. I know I sound crazy. If I were you, I wouldn't believe me either. But you don't have to. All you have to know is, for the love of God above and all things holy, never forget that we're not alone on this earth. Sometimes during the night, whenever I look out my window, I catch sight of eyes in the trees, looking back at me. Growing up, I lived in northeastern Arizona, literally about 5 miles south of the Navajo Reservation in Winslow. Naturally, being that close to the reservation, or the res, skinwalkers were a huge topic of conversation amongst the locals, and we all took it very seriously. Stories of personal experiences abounded. I was no different. Well, to start off my set of stories, I was about 9 or so. My family had gone camping in a little spot about 50 miles or so south of town called Hart Canyon, near Wiggins Crossing, if anyone's interested. We'd been there all day, and I was extremely familiar with the area as we'd camped there 20 or so times before. So my parents let me just wander about, alone in the woods. This was back in the early 90s. Anyway, I had some G.I. Joes that I'd been playing with in the nearby creek, about 80 yards from our campsite. There weren't any other campers there with us. My mom had called me back to camp for dinner, so I left and ate. I played around camp for a while and realized that I'd forgotten my toys back at the creek. So I took a flashlight and headed back that way. I knew right where I had left them, so in no time I found them and grabbed them up. As I was squatted down to grab them on the edge of the water, a sudden urgency that I had never felt before ran down my spine. I remember feeling frozen because of the fear, like the little boy on E.T. when the alien comes out of the field for the first time and he's trying to scream for his family. I looked up and pointed my flashlight to the other side of the creek, and about 10 yards down the way, I saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it was standing up. So I thought it may be a bear, but it was too skinny and not enough poofy hair. It sunk behind a tree and peered out slightly at me. I seriously was too scared to move. I just read a bit about Bigfoot for the first time since it wasn't really popular in my area. I thought for a long time that that's what I'd seen. I finally had seen enough to gather my wits and scram as fast as I could back to camp. I told my parents and they kind of dismissed it as my imagination. So I just stayed close for the rest of the trip. About 2 years later, I was at my house. I had 2 dogs. They were outside dogs. They lived their whole lives in my backyard. One night, they went psycho, barking at first at something in the alley behind my house. Then they both started whimpering. I had my window open slightly and one of the dogs straight up jumped up to the window, frantically chewed through the screen of the window and forced its way into the house. It wouldn't leave the house for 3 days. Another time when I was about 13, we used to play night games in the town. Mostly there being not much else to do, we'd walk around our neighborhood and act suspicious so the cops would come chase us around. And we'd run down the alleyways and hop into random folks' backyards to hide. Now, it was extremely common to see an intoxicated Navajo or Hopi in the alley or the street, so it was no big deal to see one in the alley behind my house that night, as we being 2 of my friends and myself, ran from a police car hot on our tail. We saw him plain as day standing in our way. We ran around him and jumped into the nearest yard to hide. We waited for the cop to pass us and hopped back out. Literally about 3 minutes went by. We ran back the way we came, and as we got to the point where the Indian had been, he was gone. Legit, in his place was a coyote sitting there watching us. We ran right past it, feet from it. And anyone who knows coyotes knows they will bail out way before you get close to them. This bugger held his ground and calmly sat and watched us run past him. We all freaked out and stayed inside for a month. My last experience was when I was about 15 or 16. My brother has a girlfriend that lived in a small community south of Winslow called Starlight Pines. About 25 miles-ish. Well, we went to go see her one day, and as we drove out, about 15 miles or so out, we saw an Indian guy standing on the side of the road, which was quite odd because the res was north of town, and it was rare to see anyone on foot south of town because it's just desert and forest for literally 80 miles. Anyway, we see this guy. He looked normal enough, flannel shirt, jeans. We got to our destination and hung out with my brother's girlfriend and her family well into the night when we decided to head back home. We hopped in his truck, a Chevy S10, and drove back the way we had come. In the same spot, we saw the Indian dude. He was still there. I remember thinking, that dude is crazy standing out there all day and into the night. What's he doing? Right as we passed him, we hear a loud bang on the back of the truck. At first, I thought we hit an animal, but I hadn't felt anything that we'd run over. I turned around and looked out the back window. My brother started to slow down, thinking there may be something wrong with the truck. In the brake lights, I see the Indian guy chasing after us. We were easily going 55 to 60 at this point, as we were about to stop. The guy is in the road, feet behind us. I scream at my brother to not stop. "Gun it, man, gun it!" He does, and being a Chevy S10, it had a speed governor on it at 80. 2 miles. 2 miles this guy keeps up with us. We're seriously freaking out. I asked my brother, what if we don't make it back to town? Or what about when we have to slow down once we get close? After those 2 miles that stretched forever, I looked back and he was gone. We got home, booked it into the house, and told our parents. The next morning, I get up and head somewhere and look at my brother's truck, thinking about the night before. I wondered what the loud bang was just before we started getting chased. Inspecting the truck, I found a handprint smeared in the dust from about 2/3 over to the right, then smeared to the right taillight. I never went there again.